You are tuned into Your Voice, Your Power with Anika. Real lives, real stories, and real hope through transformational leadership. You have entered the safe zone, the safe space for creatives, executives, business owners, dreamers, and leaders of the new school. Sharing tips, tools, and resources to thrive with authenticity as authorities on a global scale. Transformation is power, and so is your truth. Stay tuned for The Real Deal with Anika and her guests.
Good day, and welcome to Your Voice, Your Power. I am Anika Wilson, and we are talking about generational curses. And if you don't know anything about generational curses, which I think you probably should, you're going to learn today. And I have an amazing guest all the way from Arizona who is going to educate us on generational curses and how to heal, deal, and grow. So let's welcome Veronica Barragan to the show. Hey, Veronica.
Hey, Anika. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here on your podcast today.
It's a pleasure. I'm excited because I love talking about topics that are faux pas that nobody wants to talk about. So we're going to break it down. But first, tell the world who you are and what you do.
Sure. So, Veronica Barragan, I was actually born in Mexico, raised in California, Southern California, by a very traditional Mexican family. Grew up going to school there, moved to Arizona in 2001, where I was a real estate broker, believe it or not, for 15, almost 16 years. Pretty much at the top of my game as it relates to business, right? To the outer world, everything looked perfect. There was the, high school sweetheart marriage. There was the financial abundance and all of the material wealth. But what a lot of people from within, with a lot of mental health situations like depression, like anxiety, dealing with my stress, typically with a bottle of wine. Alcohol was like my go-to until one day I just decided that I could no longer continue to live this facade, this double life that I was pretty much portraying to the world. And I went out on this journey of self-healing. I never resonated with me the traditional Western approach to healing, even as a little girl. Like I always knew that I was going to be a therapist or I was going to be some kind of psychologist. But when I found out the level of investment of time, money on the career and also the mechanisms of healing, it didn't coincide with who I was intrinsically. So when I finally did make the decision to stop living this facade, I went on this like really deep spiritual journey, learning at first a lot about all the different like religious traditions in the world and spiritual traditions like Kabbalah, Hinduism, Buddhism. I was raised Catholic, so we were never really allowed to go outside of those comfort zone boxes. And went on that journey. And one day, my son, who's at that point was 15 years old, he writes this really amazing paper for his high school project on psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And he teaches me and educates me on the way our indigenous cultures still today practice plant medicine work to heal their souls, to heal body, mind, and spirit. He got accolades from his teacher, I remember. And at that point, I said, this is a journey I'm going to take on, and made a decision to go to the Amazon jungle to work with plant medicine, Mother Ayahuasca, and San Pedro with my family for 17 days. which only started the healing journey, because that was actually just the beginning of what led me into the work that I do today as a holistic therapist, Kundalini yoga holistic therapist, that now help women generationally heal their karmic wounds, curses, and trauma bonds.
So you said so much. And trauma bonding is so unhealthy. So we'll get to that later. But first, I want you to explain to women, when we talk about healing, yes,
Yeah.
you have science, you have all these things, but I want you to really, you talk about your healing journey. Break down what that means, like what it means to heal and what healing looks like.
Right. That's such a great question, because I think one of the biggest hindrances to the healing journey is that we compartmentalize it and try to
Yep.
put it in a box.
Mhm.
And it's not all love and light at all. Because when you think about the healing journey, especially about generational healing, you are feeling emotions that your ancestors could not feel themselves, could not express, could not alchemize, could not release from the body, because we know that the body keeps score. And so the healing journey is very uncomfortable. I was a seeker so my journey started in 2008 when I started to do all these different spiritual practices. A Course in Miracles was huge in my life at that point, which is a study of forgiveness. Is the teachings of the Christ consciousness. And really, when I began my healing journey, it was about getting super uncomfortable with feeling all of these emotions that I had been numbing with alcohol for such a long time. And so when I went to the Amazon jungle, I think a lot of people think, especially nowadays, we're having a renaissance of psychedelics, which I believe is being done in the correct manner. We have Rick Doblin, who funded the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and he's been doing the holy work since the 80s, really educating us, getting to the point of getting it approved through the FDA as an actual therapeutic approach to mental health healing because of all the data that they have. But I really think people think that that is like the answer, that, you just go, you plant medicine and you come back completely a changed person. When for me, it was actually quite the opposite. Going there, I had incredible experiences where I connected to my ancestors, to my lineage. I was shown spiritually how I was repeating these patterns, which later I learned about epigenetics and understood it scientifically. But it was the beginning of my healing journey, because by the time I got back, I was a real estate broker for 15 years. I was president of all these nonprofit organizations. I was involved in leadership in the local, even at an international level at a very young age. I started very young as a broker. So I was okay being around people, but coming back from the jungle, so much had happened that I could not integrate it. I could not put the puzzle pieces together. It was overwhelming. And truly, the shaman that was my teacher then told me, this is just the beginning of your journey. When you come back into life to integrate yourself, that's where really you're going to have to now continue to be okay with all those barriers that were dropped from the subconscious mind, where you basically were hiding from all these things that you experienced as a child, and that your grandmother experienced, and that your mother has experienced. So when I came back to the US, I remember the day I prayed to God on that day, and I said, why do I still feel the same? Why have I not stopped drinking alcohol? I was still drinking alcohol coming back. And between 2008 and 2015, before I went to the jungle, I tried several different types of yogas, several different types of healing modalities. I even became a certified Reiki master, and none of that helped. And I remember having this like come to Jesus moment where I prayed so hard, and it was weird because within hours I had received a message from a friend of mine who said, have you ever tried Kundalini yoga? And I said, I've heard of Kundalini, but I didn't even know there was a yoga, to be honest with you. So I went to my first class, and I come into this room like an ashram. It was a small ashram. There was a gentleman in there with a long beard. He was wearing a turban. And here I am alone. I didn't want to leave. Didn't be embarrassed to be walking out on this guy. I was like, oh my God, now I got to stay. So I sit in my first Kundalini yoga class, and I felt like I was back in the jungle. Like things were starting to make sense. I was starting to feel my emotions again. It was like, oh my God, this is what I've been looking for. And that's really when the journey actually began, because Kundalini yoga is the science of energy, which is our emotions, our energy and motion. So what I started to do was actually feel all these pent up emotions that were stuck in the body, that were wired in my nervous system, that were causing my brain to constantly secrete cortisol and adrenaline. And once I started to understand the spiritual and the biophysical, things got really uncomfortable. It was not all love and light. I was not in deep states of euphoria. It was, here's what you need to forgive yourself for. Here are the things that you need to release grievances around. Here's why you really have been angry. So really, to be honest with you, the first few years, it felt like hell. It felt like I was literally dying and with no certainty of what the future would hold. But yet, something inside of me said, this is the path, and continue. And sure enough, within a month, I had healed from the alcohol addiction. Why? Because I was regulating my nervous system. I had more brain agility. There's so much science behind this Kundalini yoga, which we can talk about in a little bit later, the symposium I just attended, where we have so much data of what it's actually doing to the brain, what it's actually doing to the nervous system. So once that started to happen, and me being also a very logical minded person, I understood what was happening in my body, which helped me then shift perceptions to truly get on the path of forgiveness, because a big part of my healing journey was actually the work of forgiveness, which a lot of people skip over in traditional therapy and in a setting where you're basically just using a pharmaceutical to try to heal yourself. So thank you for that question, because it was never a walk in the park. I believe that we're always on the healing journey, but I don't see healing as fixing something. I see healing as I'm evolving, because now I'm in a whole new era and phase of my life as it relates to my marriage of 26 years, as it relates to the relationship I have with my children, with myself, with my mother, which was a lot of healing that I had to do around that. So really it's my continued practice is this basically vitality that allows me to go beyond limited patterns, because in essence what we're doing is, if we're not growing, we're dying. And every time you're growing, you're going to have to face a part of yourself that doesn't believe you're worthy or that you are capable of doing these things that your ancestors have never done.
I love all of that. And you said something, you talked about vitality, but the one thing I want people to understand is healing is a journey. That's the first thing. People think that healing is a pill. It's a solution. You walk in, you go to therapy. Oh, I don't feel any different. I went to therapy one time, or I did this, or I went to, the ashram, or I went to a yoga class, or I did this and nothing changed. Well, that's because you didn't change. Your mind didn't change. Your perspective didn't change. And you definitely didn't do the work, because healing is work. And we have to understand we're not what happened to us, but we do have the responsibility of dealing with it. And that's what a lot of people don't like, is that we have to do the work for something that we didn't do. And it sucks. Yeah. It sucks. It's not fair. And to your point, we spend our whole lives dealing with it, because one trauma may be dealt with a certain way, and another trauma, we may have to try different methods to deal with that trauma. We may be able to overcome it easily. Some traumas that may not seem as severe may be more severe. And so there is no one and done. And from all of that, what I want people to get from what you said and from what I just said is that it's also a lifestyle. Healing is a lifestyle. You cannot heal from trauma and then turn around and go right back doing the same things that you did. You can't go hang out in circles of secondary trauma. You can't just dance around and, act like, oh, I'm good now. I could go back to doing what I was doing. No, honey, that's not how it goes. So I love how you talked about your journey, because it showed the developmental process, not just of you overcoming your self-soothing, but you really being able to peel back the layers of the onion to determine like what really was the problem. And sometimes we may never figure the problem out, but we may be able to deal with it better and cope with it. And I think a lot of people do not want to hear and weren't ready to hear about forgiveness, because that to me is the hardest,
Yes.
hardest part of healing, but also trauma bonds. And that is something that I think is generational, specifically because when families go through traumas, that trauma bond is like kryptonite. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I'm sure you have experience with trauma bonding, because you've mentioned it multiple times. So tell us about it.
Yeah, that's such a brilliant way to put it too, that about healing is a lifestyle, because that's truly what it is. But the trauma bond can be explained also biophysically, and it can be explained energetically and spiritually, because basically epigenetics proves, and there's so much data on this now. It's actually been around for a long time, since like the 80s and 90s, but of course mainstream media still hasn't really brought it to the surface, because it really will debunk everything we know about genes and genetics, which we now know that very few physical diseases are actually genetically passed. But what does get passed through the lineage is our predisposition to trauma. And the reason why trauma bond is so difficult to get out of spiritually, we're in a university. This is life. And we graduate through forgiveness, period. Like when you forgive, you learn the lesson, whether you're a religious person or not, whether you follow the teachings of Jesus Christ or believe he was here or not. When you forgive, you are basically coming from a place of emotional intelligence that then realizes that what was done to you was not because of your level of worth, but because of a person being in complete pain. And that's the spiritual healing aspect of trauma bonding, because we only can heal at the level of the mind ultimately. The mind is our thoughts, awareness, our emotions, which then impact the brain and the nervous system. But in trauma bond situations, it feels unconscious. For example, Holocaust survivors, they now have done studies where 3 generations down, and they have high levels of depression, of anxiety. Women of color, our indigenous brothers and sisters that were massacred, that were, colonized, that were stripped from their connection to their spiritual practice. That was done on purpose, because that trauma response then becomes a way that the genes learn to express themselves. So when we think about addiction, for example, you would think, if I saw my mother go through a lot of addiction, or my father, and why would I do that to my own kids? Well, the problem is not that. The problem is that they were not able to heal. And if whatever they went through, then your genes now become way more predisposed based on your environment. This is why lifestyle, what you said, is so important. Based on the environment, to have a higher susceptibility of you now being addicted, of you now picking the same toxic relationships as your parents, even when you say, I will never marry someone like my parent. No, but your energy is speaking way louder than words, because it's your thoughts, feelings, and emotions that have stored these memories basically from the subconscious mind, where you've learned these behaviors. So the thing about trauma bond is that it's unconscious. There's a lot of guilt and shame around it. We don't want to acknowledge and admit that we are repeating the same patterns, because we're trying so hard not to. And what we don't understand is that it's both a spiritual component of the forgiveness work that needs to be done. And a lot of people say, well, they get triggered, especially if they've never done any nervous system regulation or brain regulation. To tell someone to forgive is very triggering. And when I work with my clients, that's like one of the last things we start to work on, because I understand. And to be honest with you, a lot of these generational patterns, like for example, one that gets tucked in under the rug a lot is like sexual abuse, right? Nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to mention it. And I believe that everything is forgivable, but the first step is you got to acknowledge, if as a child you were not seen and you were not heard and you were not believed about something like that, and it was just tucked under the rug, you unconsciously are operating under that program. And this is what's scary, that fear, I mean, I've seen it happen so much. You have a fear of your children going through that. That is a vibration that now surrounds your child, and it's almost like a magnet of just repeating and repeating and repeating itself. So a big part of this trauma bond, I understand, is acknowledgement and awareness, and actually, being seen for what has occurred. And that's the hard part about generational healing, that we keep tucking things under the rug, pretending like they didn't happen, because I think ultimately we feel that it is unhealable, because some of these things are very, very horrible that have been passed down in our lineages. So we do it unconsciously. It's biophysical because we're addicted to that cortisol and adrenaline from these experiences, but it's also spiritual because we
I
can do the healing work.
I love it. And
Go ahead.
it's so interesting because I was the opposite. My mom was a social worker and then turned anthropologist, and we grew up talking about everything. And then my oldest daughter told me that I kind of almost, what's the word, jinxed my girls. And it just so happened both of them have been sexually abused. And people think that there's something wrong with you when you speak life out loud, when you go through things out loud. And people like us, we don't go through it because we're bragging or we just want to, you know what I'm saying, make people uncomfortable.
Yep.
First of all, we talk about it to heal and to raise awareness, because back in the day, it was 1 in 4 women had been sexually assaulted. And now I'm pretty sure it's 2, if not 3 out of 4. And,
Yep.
this whole thing of, your grandmother never talking about it until it happens to the granddaughter and says, oh, it happened to me, 1, 2, 3, 4 times, same thing with having babies or anything. They don't want to talk about things. And the reality is that creates ignorance around the topic, ignorance around how to resolve it, ignorance around, how to prevent it, all these things. And so it's funny that you bring up sexual assault, because those are the things that happen in families that cause domino effects. They cause resentment. They cause, issues among different generations in the family, auntie, uncle, you shouldn't have said that, or it happened. There's a lot of cultures where there's multiple generations inside one household. When I lived in Hawaii, I learned that, and I was working in social services, and I said, I can no longer work in social services here because our cultures are so different. What's normal to me is not normal to them. And I'm not the right person to go in someone's house in a culture that's different than mine and dictate what it is, you know what I mean? What is good and what is not. But I wanted to talk about trauma bonds because the problem with our society today is that we have social media. We have people feeling like they can say and do anything, people triggering people on top of triggering people, talking about things and beating the horse. It's like people are trying to heal. But when you just sit and you harp on these topics and you expose people to things that they're trying to move on from and things like that, it is literally a form of bondage, and it's really trying to teach healthy communication. Once you know better, we have to do better. And it's up to us, the practitioners who are working in the field, who are doing these things, us, and reality is we're influencers, whether we want to be or not. And I tell everybody, if you have a online business and you are visible and you're found on Google or TikTok or anything, you are an influencer. And we have to teach each other how to heal. We have to heal. And as women, it is so important to unlearn the things that we were taught that are no good for us. And it's that simple, right?
It really is. It is. It is that simple. And what stops us is, well, what happens with trauma, right? So when we go through emotional trauma, physical trauma, sexual trauma, especially the brain, the amygdala changes in size, the hippocampus changes in size. You are constantly running adrenaline and cortisol. So when you want to stop identifying with that trauma, it feels like you're bonded. It feels like you're stuck. You could be in your bed and this is something that may have happened to you at 8 years old. Your body doesn't know, because remember, the body keeps score of that. So when we talk about this, the problem is that it's not that it's easier, it's just that we have been programmed to feel like a victim.
Mm-hmm.
And that gives us, it's hard to hear, but it gives us an excuse to be angry at the world,
Mm-hmm.
to basically not level up. So when we do a lot of the spiritual psychotherapy work, we do that work of forgiveness because there is a process. It's not easy, but there is a process and it's been laid out to us. And I had to follow that myself with my own. I had these two biggest Judas in my life, I called them. These were the two people that caused me the most amount of pain in my life, which me holding on to that anger, me holding on to that grievance took my vitality away.
Yep.
It made me unstable. It made
Mm-hmm.
me go drink alcohol and all these different things. When I realized that when my nervous system started to get regulated, when my brain became more agile, because there's science now, Kundalini yoga, we just did a symposium where they did this study on Ukraine war veterans, because, there's a big war happening over there right now, where they put them through 8 weeks. And it was just an 11-minute meditation that has been studied by a lot of different universities. After 8 weeks, like their hippocampus actually grew in size. It was shrinked because of the trauma. It grew in size. So of course, that's why they were feeling better. Of course, that's why they had more faith and hope. So the problem with trauma bound is that it's unconscious, but it has to do with the fact that the brain became deteriorated, the cognitive function, which is why people get so triggered when you talk to them about the work of forgiveness. And I'm not saying that the work of forgiveness says you're going to go become best friends with this person that, hurt you in this way. Because to be honest with you, when you heal, you actually are really good about setting boundaries. You're actually really good about, standing up for yourself when you couldn't as a child.
Boundaries is the key word. And that is, if nothing else, that's what I want women to understand is you have a right to have boundaries. You don't owe anybody an explanation. You don't owe anybody anything. You owe it to yourself to have boundaries, because that is the key to the majority of the experiences, the negative experiences that we have. Our intuition tells
Absolutely.
us not to do something, we do it. We want something, we communicate it, we don't get it, and then we're angry. We have to enforce boundaries. And you keep mentioning the nervous system. That is so, and you keep mentioning Body Keeps the Score, y'all. That is a book, The Body Keeps the Score, and there's also a workbook that goes with that. And it is very true, because my daughter has functional neurological disorder. And when they said to me that it was caused by trauma, I kept looking at them sideways, and they said, you don't want it to be trauma related because you're a psychologist. And I said, no, it's not that. It's that it's causing her paralysis. She's literally paralyzed. She's literally having seizures all day, every day in and day out. And this went on for 3 years. And she was in therapy. She then had to have PT, OT, and all these things. And I didn't know about the book, The Trauma Keeps the Score, but 10 years ago, I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia. And it's very interesting that people associate these conditions with trauma. And I think it's compounding. It's compounding effects. You have trauma, but you also have a lot of environmental factors of the person that has experienced trauma that is in that sense where they don't feel safe. And you cannot heal if you're in an environment where you do not feel safe. And so finding a way out and adopting a new lifestyle, that's the best thing I can say, lifestyle, because it includes food. It includes changing who's around you, changing who has access to you, changing your support system, sometimes changing your location. You have to change your mindset first. You change your mindset, you change everything else, and you can heal, deal, and grow. Because at the end of the day, you cannot show up, and you said level up, when you are in fight or flight, because it's not healthy. It is not healthy. And whether it's a generational curse, whether it's generational trauma, whether it's new trauma, old trauma, his trauma, her trauma, you got to deal with it. And you got to find a way to overcome what has happened to you. Because at the end of the day, traumas are going to keep coming. And the better you get at dealing with them, the sooner you have control over your life. So I want to ask you, do you have any words of encouragement for our listeners on the topic that we talked about today, for Gen X, Y, Z, and Alpha? how to heal, deal, and grow?
I think the number one thing that I like to say is everything in this world is healable. It does not matter what it is that you've been through, and it does not matter whether it's something that has been passed down through your lineage. And that, yes, at the root cause of all physical illness lies an emotion that has not been expressed and felt. And that the future of medicine, if not already here, is nervous system regulation, is brain agility, and that we have the inner medicine cabinet that we're seeking, that it is not outside of ourselves, that within us, we can activate these healing components. We call it Kundalini energy, which is white tantric energy that we can use beyond healing to evolve, to allow our consciousness to expand, because ultimately the metaphysical aspect of a nervous system is consciousness. And when somebody has a regulated nervous system, we're conscious, we're in the present, we're not in the trauma of the past, and we're also not afraid of the future. And more importantly, you learn to honor emotions instead of run away from them. There's nothing wrong if you have anger coming up. It needs to be expressed and felt. There's something that you're being shown. But we all know that if you stay in the anger, look at activists in the world, right? The ones that are driven by the fuel of anger, they live to be 30 to 35 years old because of the chemical imbalances that are happening within us. So like you said, deal with the emotions, deal with the things that you're working through. Know that it's a journey. There's no fast fix. Some people in my situation heal in months, where others has taken them 4 to 5 years, but they've healed because they've shown up and they've decided and committed to be willing to allow themselves to actually heal.
I love that. I love that. And there was something you said that I was going to harp on, but I cannot remember what it was just that quick. But you said all things are healable. And I think that's powerful, because a lot of people feel like there are things that happen to us that they break us, and you're not broken. You're just,
No.
you're scarred, and that's okay. But you can absolutely heal and you can move on. So with that, can you tell listeners where and how to find you?
Sure, absolutely. So they can find me on Instagram at Veronica Barragan I am, or YouTube. I usually post a weekly healing session there as well, and they could find me at Veronica Barragan.
All right. And I will make sure to put all of your information in the info and description. I want to thank everyone for tuning in to another episode of Your Voice, Your Power with Anika. And I want you to take time to reflect on the generational curses that may be impacting how you show up in your life, your business, and your family. And if nothing else, remember, you are powerful, and a trauma does not have to live there anymore. Any last words, Veronica?
Just thank you. Such an honor. Great conversation. And please continue the holy work you're doing, because it's amazing.
Thank you so much. All right, listeners, have a wonderful day.